community is like just not possible um, past a certain number of people. Um,
Mm.
like the very small groups of people can like form communities, but I don't know that like there is a Twitter community, for instance, like in general. Like they form, I think communities can form within Twitter, but then they're like quickly like destroyed by people entering into those communities from Twitter at large. And I think it's like the story of the internet is that like there used to be communities because the internet was a smaller place and there were like forums and all these different things where you would meet people who like you actually either had things in common with already or could bond in ways where you would form things in common. But the internet has like become this like place where so many people are in anything that you're involved in, uh, that it just nothing feels like community to me, or very little feels like community to me anymore. And maybe one of the things happening in this book is because it like takes place like in the '90s. Communities were like different at that point, and like socializing was different. Where to a certain degree, because the book also like continues on, and you sort of see that like the advent of the MMORPG was also maybe when those things started to change. So yeah, I don't know. I don't have like I have not thought a whole lot about that like idea, but it's something that I've like begun to suspect as I like join each new social media site to try to escape Twitter. Is like all the things wrong with these places often involve um, like all these conflicts that happen because of how big the like space is and how nobody actually knows anyone else. Like even in the sort of weird way that people used to know one another on forums, you like didn't know who that person truly was. You like didn't know what they looked like. Like they had a fake name and a fake avatar. But there were you could like name them all potentially. You could like be like all the people in the something awful forum about video games who regularly post are these usernames. And there's just like it just like doesn't feel like that to me anymore.
Hmm, that's interesting. Oh, and hey, welcome, Eli. We just started talking about
Hello.
community. Um,
Nice.
yeah, so I could respond to that forever because my other background is in psychology, and there's so many things I could say, but I'll kind of bring it back to the book at hand. I think that I would say yes, I think to some degree when you get to a critical mass of people, it's really hard to find the feeling of community. I would also temper that though by saying that I think there are ways you can kind of deceive yourself into feeling a sense of community when it does get large by like, I don't know, like affirming group membership or common interests. Like, I agree on Twitter, it's really hard to have a community because it's sort of like everything's open to everyone. But I would say on like Reddit, for example, people will often it's often subdivided by interest and people will post that way and be like, "Oh, which one of you did this?" Like I just saw something like that on the Chicago subreddit. Um,
Mm.
but that's
I mean, I
neither.
think that there are, I agree with you that like
Mhm.
there's like two multiple different kinds of communities, right? Because it's like you have things like Swifties, like is that not a community of a kind? And
Mhm.
there's many, many, many people who would identify as that. But also they don't have the kind of like, oh, we're hanging out and I know everyone that's here that you would get in a small forum or the kinds of things that we were talking about before, where it's like that's a much more intimate community that is operating at a different in a different way.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel like there's something to be analyzed here with um the scene in which or like I guess a series of events in which Marx dies. So, just a content warning, there is violence, there is murder and gun violence. But yeah, to talk about that, so I think a big part of the book is that, right, it's Sadie, Sam, and Marks. Um, and then Sadie and Mark start dating. Sam is kind of like not feeling great about that. But then Marx is killed by a shooter, um, which let me just make sure I have the details right. So, um, yeah, so they're looking for Sam because they're mad that he legalized gay marriage in the virtual world that he made, Mapletown. But because Sam's not there, they kill Marx instead. And so I feel like there's something here about community and that smallness of community and that like how personal the decisions for the game world feel.
Hmm. That's interesting. 'Cause, like when I read it, I saw it a lot more as things that felt more like inceldom.
Hmm.
Because if I remember right, it's like there's like two people who storm the office, and that like one of them has a gun, and at the end, by the end of it, one of the people who invades the office is trying to talk the other one down,
Mm.
and that they're unable to do that. They shoot Marks, and then I think they shoot themselves. And I want to say that part of what their like method for, or part of their reasoning around it, is that like their girlfriend left them, or like someone left them because they met someone else in the game. And so it's like for me it's that there's the community aspect, but it's also the like felt very much about the toxic masculinity involved in that whole like people being sexually available. I don't know, it's very gross.
Yeah.
I mean, that's also community too, right? Like that's one of the things that when I'm like nostalgic about the internet, like early internet, part of
Mm-hmm.
the reason I'm able to do that is I was like unaware of those communities existing. And now it's like impossible not to be aware of them existing. Uh,
Mm,
you know what I mean? Like I, I was never a part of 4chan. Like knew it
yeah.
existed, um, like vaguely, but it was very easy for me to sort of pretend it didn't
You're
exist.
like, yeah, they're weirdos, whatever.
Yeah, yeah. They say gross things, and the same way that like I was a part of something awful, and the overlap there was very huge, and so it
Mm,
was very easy to be like, well, they're just like a little worse than something awful is. Um, but now you know those communities have like spilled into larger places and have grown and all these other things that make it um yeah, so not to disagree with you, I guess, but
no, no, I mean, I think that's
yeah.
a totally valid point, and like worth pointing out that like they could be gross and awful, but it is a form of community for people too. Community doesn't isn't always positive, strictly positive, or like community and people making connection is good, but they're not always bonding about the best things.
Yeah. Yeah. Keith also brings up another interesting word, which is nostalgia. Um, and I wonder, I feel like there's something with nostalgia in this book. So yeah, it does take place in the 90s. Um, and you know me, I was a 90s kid for a couple years. Then I
Mhm.
left. I decided no longer to be I decided to be in the 2000s. Um, but so it takes place in like the past, but within a lot of people's lifetimes. And there's this, and like I think in the book they explicitly will say things like, "Oh, in that time, things were like this." And so it's kind of calling out that aspect of it being in the past, and I'm kind of wondering like what does that serve?
that's that's I mean that's super interesting to me because I feel like there's like a way that the way it's taking video games seriously has to do with nostalgia. So I don't have like a fully
Mm.
formed thought on this necessarily yet, but because I had not thought about it in those terms, but like just thinking about it like sort of rhetorically, because people have been trying to convince people that video games are like a real thing that you should care about for as long as video games have existed, right? Like
Hmm.
since Pong. And like maybe the way that this book approaches it of like why you should care like is like one half um like approaching it from the artists as opposed to the people playing the games, and then one half like nostalgia, because nostalgia is like a super powerful thing, right? That can convince people of all kinds of things. Yeah, so I don't know. Those are just some thoughts.
It also kind of reminded me of what was that um documentary, like video games the movie, or like indie games the movie or something. It had like
I
Phil
was
Fish and
I was
uh
literally just being like, when did Braid come out?
huh. Right, yeah, and so like I don't know. I feel like the '90s, it's like was such so ubiquitous with like the rise of like video games and like pop culture. Um, and and so people really latch onto it, but it's also like if you were an indie in the '90s, like you know, you're like John Blow now in San Francisco, like holed up in some penthouse. Um, and I think Kelly, at like the way beginning, you were talking about it being this like, and also Keith, like that is this like romanticized view of indie dev and making games and stuff, and like it was like that in the '90s. Um, and I think they capitalized that and the nostalgia.
Mhm.
I
And I guess like besides video games, it was also like technology in the 90s was big, right? Like it was like the beginning of regular people being like ensnared into like the tech industries, like the culture of the tech industry. Um, so I think that maybe has a little bit to do with it too. Like even if you didn't play video games, if you were alive in the 90s, you like remember like technology just like being a part of people's lives in a way that the further back you go, the less, at least technology in like terms of like electronics, and like electronic media.
Yeah, geez, haven't you read Donna Haraway? Don't you know that everything is technology and we're enmeshed within it? Um, but yeah, I think that I wonder if nostalgia partially is serving the book's work of building that sense of like intimacy within games. So I think the community, in my mind, is kind of leading to intimacy and leading to the personal. The book is, in many ways, about the connection between these people, these two, three people. And it's also about how the games that they build also like touch people artistically in ways that um, are like new and astounding. And I wonder if the nostalgia, like not directly, but sort of aesthetically, gives that, like reinforces that sense of intimacy. So, like, Keith, I think you mentioned a while ago that it was like there are games where that are mentioned in the book that, like, if you searched up video games online, you wouldn't find those. Um, so yeah, I wonder if it's something like sort of aesthetically that nostalgia is creating that sense of intimacy, and then the intimacy is kind of like validating the the way that games are meaningful to people and make connections.
I feel like that's definitely happening. Like that's super interesting because it reminds me of Ishiguro, who like all his novels work that way.
Mm.
Um, like Never Let Me Go, like the way that that romance works in that is like the way you're describing, um, the way that this book might be working. Like I have no idea if they're at all, if it's she's like at all, if the author's at all like influenced by him, but that's like how his books work, with nostalgia.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially because Never Let Me Go is like looking back on a person's childhood and it's telling the story in that way. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think one of the so I was saying at the beginning, I disliked the experience of reading the book, but I don't think that means it shouldn't exist. And in fact, I'm very glad that it exists because I think one of the things that it is working to do is to like validate games as an artistic pursuit and not only as an artistic pursuit but as like a consumptive object that is also meaningful. So it's like their connection, it's the way it's released to the public. It I think touches a lot of people. Um but I think it does a good job of that. And something that I've discussed with some of you before is like it's not even really a game about or it's not a book about game development as it is for game developers, but
Hmm.
it's a book that you can kind of show to your grandma and be like, "This is why I care about games, and, like, this is how it's meaningful." Yeah, I feel like that kinda connects to the idea that it takes games seriously, which I think there were some moments where I wanted to make fun of the book. There's, like, this line where it's like, "They programmed so hard that their fingers bled." I was like, "I've never done that, so I'm not a real game developer." Like, obviously I'm fake, but,
Yeah.
um
You just
but
gotta
it's
code harder.
yeah, I gotta type harder.
Need
No
more passion.
right. I gotta get rid of this ergonomic keyboard and just get, like, a
More Red Bull, more staying up too late.
um, but actually Keith raised a good point when I first mentioned that it's like it's trying to depict the difficulty of, I guess, programming and development in a way that's, like, not really easy to depict through words. And so,
Mhm.
even if there are moments where I'm kind of like, "Okay, that feels silly or, weird," it's still the book still fundamentally cares about game development in a very serious way. But again, like we were saying before, kind of from the lens of the humanities.
It's almost like the like parallel to it is like is like if a book was told from the perspective of like a theater kid about like acting.
Hmm.
Because one of the things I think is ironic about the book is it takes video games seriously, um, but actually is probably not representative of how video games feel to most people playing video games. Like I feel like it's
Mm.
representative of how video games feel to me, um, in certain ways, and like people like me who are like, um, people who like ended up becoming poets and play artsy games, view video games as high art and think about moments in which they're really moved and met people in their community or in communities that they like were part of. Um, but like I also think of like how many people play like games on their cell phones who don't think about video games that way. Like that's maybe the majority of people playing video games, or people who play like what is like now called like casual gamers or whatever, like people who only play Madden, or whatever. Like the video game is not very representative of either those people or the people making those games. Maybe even like I don't know that the idea of the people working on that. This may be me being biased, but like simulations are maybe like a different kind of game, and a
Mhm.
different kind of vision and a different kind of like whatever, than the kinds of games that this is actually romanticizing and talking about. I think it's useful for me to show people this book and be like, this is how I feel about video games. But video games are like way more expansive than this book is like even trying to talk about. And the audience too is like It's like a thing that I notice more and more the more that I like read about, or like when I join some like TikTok or something, and like they start recommending me video game clips and things, like how much stuff I'm like, I have no interest in this, even though I like video games. It's like a different part of the community that is like interested in just things I don't care about, or whatever.